All right, guys, welcome to episode number 19. I believe this is part 2. I guess you could call it episode number 18, part 2, whatever you want to do there. We had part 1 last week. Michael Bain and Dean Brandt talked about all the good stuff in the forestry service and what foresters do. And we're back for part 2. We're going to talk a little bit about prescribed fires, which we kind of didn't get to last time. We really wanted to discuss that with some people and kind of go from there. Michael, Dean, how you guys doing, man?
Good. I can't complain.
Yeah,
Good.
doing fantastic. Other than got a little freezing rain trying to happen outside right now, but we'll take it.
It's
Take it. I'm not ready. We were just talking. I'm not ready for hot summer yet.
Well, let's just jump right into it. Prescribed fires. Dean, you want to take the helm here?
Well, sure. So, a lot of people talk about prescribed fire out in the prairie and your set aside CRP program management every, what is it, Michael, every 3 to 5 years of mid-story management stuff. That's pretty common. We hear about that regularly with people. And, a lot of CRP programs through the government agencies. So, that's not something that's really that new. You hear a lot about it. It's kind of been around for a while, but a topic that I've really been, talking with Michael a lot about over the last couple of years is doing the prescribed burns in the woodlands and the benefits of them, what it's doing, some of the species of flowers and trees and bushes and stuff, how it affects them, what some of them are coming back that we haven't seen in years. And Michael's the expert on this. I'm not going to try to, take his fire away from him, but, it's so, it's kind of one of those things that, in this day and age, you think we would know more about it than we really do. But the amount of benefit to it that we are seeing already is amazing. So I'm just going to kind of walk away from this and let Michael take the helm here. And I'm sure I'll have some questions as he's talking because I'm still learning myself about it. But I'm excited to keep hearing more about it. And what, as everybody's learning more, and sharing information, all the benefits that we're seeing across the country from doing the prescribed burns in the woodland. So, Michael, take it away.
Well, I'll just go ahead and say that while I start talking about this, I'll be talking very fast and at times. And if you ever need something clarified or have a question about absolutely anything or think anything needs to be specified, just please say it. And I'll be happy to slow down and go through something more in depth just to make sure everybody's on the same page here. As Dean said, it's been well known for a long time that to maintain early succession habitat, you have to have a continual disturbance regimen. And sometimes that takes the form of strip disking, bush hogging, herbicide applications, things like that. Or you can do it kind of as God intended, which is with fire. One of the great benefits of fire is it fully removes a thatch layer in these early succession habitats and gets the light to the dirt. There is just bare soil that is burnt, charred, and it is ready to go. So that way in the springtime, the sun starts to hit it, that soil heats up really fast. And as it's heating up faster, it's encouraging all this plant growth to really take off. Whereas opposed to where it's insulated under a nice layer of thatch, it's going to really take that a lot longer to get up to those soil temperatures that are required to inspire these perennial herbaceous plants to take off. So with that kind of understood, as we move to the woodland, why would you want to burn in the woodland? Most people think, and this is purely going to be about the central hardwoods. So hopefully a lot of people are from that area. So a lot of these trees that are going to be kind of charismatic and very important in like the cultural eye, I guess, per se, of this area will be oaks and hickories. Oaks and hickories are the backbone of the central hardwood region. They do all the heavy lifting in terms of how many species they can host for invertebrates. And then they form the basis of the food chain with all their mass production and the like. Oaks, as we talked last week, oaks are kind of midway through the successional landscape. So they start with so we have a very early, very aggressive pioneering species like cherry and tulip poplar are two that most people will be very familiar with. Sweet gum, if you're more down south. Those three are extremely fire intolerant and extremely fast growing. So any kind of disturbance event that involves a fire will easily kill these species because they've evolved no natural ability to cope with fire. They have thin bark. Their whole idea for how to get through life is to grow extremely fast and produce a bunch of seed. They don't really worry about living that long. While they can be long-lived species like tulip poplar, typically they're less concerned about that. Their bark is thinner, and once again, they're extremely susceptible to fire. Now we move to oaks and hickories. Oaks and hickories have thick bark that is very insulative, and the main purpose for this is fire resistance. If we move kind of into a concept of them sprouting and growing, oaks and hickories are something just like walnut is another perfect example of this, of a species that can be clipped or destroyed, grazed, browsed, mowed to the ground and perpetually resprout every single year that this plant gets top killed for a multitude of reasons, it will always resprout. This resprouting is not really an adaptation to herbivores, more so than it is an adaptation to fire. And the reason that you would want that is the fire comes through, it top kills you. Now you have an ability to persist. So you get top killed, you simply resprout from the root and try it again. If anybody's ever tried to dig up an oak sapling out of your yard and move it to a more desirable spot, you know that has an absolutely massive taproot, as well as a hickory. It's like a carrot below ground. And we know that oaks and hickories are extremely slow growing in their first few years of life. Those first 3 to 5 years, their main emphasis is on developing this massive storage root down beneath the grade. And once again, as they develop this massive root, the sole purpose of that is to act as a very, 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 very large battery. So that way you can get burn off, every 3 years for a very long time. And as you store more and more energy in this gigantic taproot, now every time you get burnt, you have an ability to sprout faster and grow faster because this root's getting bigger and bigger. So eventually you get top killed, and you might be able to grow 4 feet in 1 year after a fire. And so most people, worry about, well, how do I get the good regeneration that I want, these desirable hardwoods like oaks and hickories, when you have things like tulip poplar and cherry and sweet gum that grows so fast, or if you're down south, some of your pines. Well, that's the fantastic thing. A tulip poplar can be, it can grow feet a year, especially once it gets, established. In 10 years, that thing can be, 15 feet tall, if not 20. Well, every time that seed germinates post-fire, a fire goes through and kills those early successional species, and then that oak gets top killed and it resprouts. Well, with time, you get a very large built-up bed of oak seedlings under the trees, and finally, that last time you have a fire that'll come through, and it kills all the other stuff that was competing with it. These trees resprout, go up, and now they're growing feet a year, these oaks and hickories are. And they start casting shade and producing a very small canopy of these short, increasing in height trees. And lies your example of how they can compete now with these extremely fast-growing species. It's all based upon disturbance regimen. So that's kind of the basis for the theory of how we realize that fire is quite important in these eastern landscapes, especially these central hardwood landscapes. Now to tie it more into what people are interested here, the oak hickory landscape with its filtered light from its medium shade of its canopies, and a well-burnt landscape at that, produces remarkable amounts of forage on the ground. I was doing some reading earlier to get you some fantastic examples here. This is a paper by Lashley et al., and it says that just burning a woods, and this is just running a ground fire underneath a closed canopy forest, will increase the forage by about two times, so it will double what's available. Now, burning underneath the woods with a 20% reduction in overstory canopy, so you're letting 20% of the sunlight come through to the ground, with the ground fire, increases forage by 8 times. That's a remarkable number.
That
is massive. And then there was now as we look more towards fire return interval, so like how often you should burn your woods, it seems like the magic number for most species that people are interested in would be, so like we have our turkeys and whitetail, and these are the two that would be most impressed with this regimen. They say 3 to 5 years is the ideal return interval for maintaining really good turkey brood rearing habitat, as well as premier forage for whitetails to keep that understory invigorated. So this goes hand in hand now that we're talking about forage. Well, this continual burning scheme is going to keep killing all this woody undergrowth that's in the woods. Anything they say smaller than your thumb will be very easily killed by a ground fire. So what it's going to do is it's going to keep the leaf litter off the ground and keep regenerating not only these trees that we want, but also a bunch of herbaceous plants. And these herbaceous plants are the desired browse for most animals, especially deer. Deer really, really, really prefer native vegetation to browse upon. And keeping not only these trees resprouting, so you're having very soft, fleshy growth off these trees every spring in large amounts that these animals will really desire to consume, but it's also the herbaceous native wildflowers and grasses that will be increasing massively in populations.
Mike, what's the one flower that you mentioned that somebody had seen that they hadn't seen in this region for a long time, but it was after a burn? There was one you told me about that was unbelievable that we hadn't seen in this area in decades, maybe hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm. So there's a multitude of species that can present like this. At least in this area, there is a species that probably a lot of people are familiar with, and it's called prairie dock. It's in the genus Silphium. It's an extremely long-lived perennial that has no capacity for shade tolerance. It is a full direct sun obligate. It cannot grow underneath a full canopy or even a partial canopy. It has to have a lot of sun. I found a population of these individuals growing north of where we are currently located and in Indiana. And I find it very interesting that a population of shade intolerant plants can exist. Now, this is along an old railroad. So clearly, back when the engines were coal fired, they were throwing sparks, they were igniting ground fires along these railways constantly. This is well known, and a lot of people study early succession ecology along rail lines. And the population of prairie dock I located there, and that kind of really blows a hole in the whole closed contiguous canopy of Indiana theory, because with the advent of herbicides and large-scale farming, there's been I would say that long-lived plant that has to be 5 to 7 years old before it can even flower would be it would be very unlikely for it to increase its range under the current land use scheme that is employed in the eastern United States, especially in the Corn Belt. I just really do not see that happening. So this is clearly a relic population. It's clearly a relic population from a time of when this area was wide open. There were large expanses of frequently burned ground. You have things like this that really point in that direction. Just the presence of fire-tolerant trees is the biggest one, but then looking more at these herbaceous plants that are full sun obligates, there's no other reason they would be here. They are purely dependent upon that for their life. There's a multitude of other species up in that area that are just quite uncommon. There's a lot of native shrubs that are shade intolerant. Just in the woods we are in today, there's a large population of chokecherry. Chokecherry doesn't grow in shade. It was very small. These populations, they were clonal patches, but they were getting shaded out quite aggressively. And the area we were at was right kind of in the confluence of the hillier areas that meet that more what I would consider prairie prone per se area to the north. So it was clearly in the past highly burnt, and these are relics of that or artifacts per se of that historic management scheme that was implemented mainly by Native Americans, but that scheme's now been broken for since contact.
A lot of years now.
I guess the importance of fire ecologically. One thing that you will notice when you start to burn a woodland is that the more open it gets and the more you remove that leaf layer, the more herbaceous plants are going to respond, and you're going to express a seed bank there that was probably otherwise unknown. A lot of these plants have very long dormancy periods where their seeds can be dormant in the soil for 20, 30, 40 years. So you go through and you get the canopy open, you start burning, and you're going to see an expression of all these native plants that have just simply been waiting. And that can be quite interesting. And as you go through and you can kind of keep track of these plants that will be coming up and stuff like that, you can kind of learn some of the more of the native plants to your region that might like these kind of mixed open areas. And they'll be there. Some will show up, some will not. It depends how long the property's been wooded. If it's been densely wooded for over 100 years, you're probably not going to get a huge expression of some of these plants, but there will be some of the more aggressive ones that you might begin to notice. All of these plants, once again, are fantastic for wildlife. The biggest thing this fire is pushing back is the shade-tolerant species. So a lot of these beech and maple will be starting to intrude upon your woodland and creep in under these oak canopies. And they have no capacity for fire tolerance, absolutely none. The bark just falls right off of a smaller American beech when they get burnt under. Even low-intensity ground fires are remarkably aggressive when it comes to these shade-tolerant species.
So I'm going to lead you down the one road I really want to make sure we get down.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to love this one of how important it is. And I didn't have a clue about this until I met Michael about 2 years ago.
No.
Is the importance and the use of the fire and what it does for the invasives.
Yep.
This kind of ties into our last episode. And this piece to me blew me away because not only the undesired trees, but the invasives that we all fight in all of these different regions. And when Michael started talking about this, I mean, the light bulb went out, above my head was just like, wow,
Yep.
How do we not know this? I've spent, I can't tell you how many hours last year in a skid loader with a forestry head drum, grinding up trees, chemical applications, and I'm still fighting it. And then I talk to Michael and I feel like, oh my gosh, how did I not know this? So Michael, you gotta lay this one on us because it's amazing.
You absolutely read my mind. That was the next point I was going to. So fantastic. I'm glad to see we're on the same wavelength. But a lot of the invasive shrubs and species that we have that are shade tolerant, as I just talked about, a lot of these native shade tolerant trees really don't like fire. So these exotic shade tolerant shrubs really also do not like fire. A lot of these are native, as we spoke about last time, to Eastern Asia. Eastern Asia doesn't have the same fire regime historically that the Eastern United States has had. So when those shrubs evolved over there, they did not have to deal with this constant threat of a fire. So they have no capacity to deal with it. Particularly honeysuckle is remarkably susceptible to fire. So a ground fire, as it goes through, it kills these plants that don't have an ability to root sprout. So it burns the root collar right at the base where it turns from stem to root, and it kills these species. They have absolutely no tolerance to fire. Especially honeysuckle has extremely thin bark and is easily killed with ground fire. And repetitive ground fire over the years on a 3 to 5 year interval is fantastic for keeping these species out of your woodland. Honeysuckle can't get that big by that point. A nice hot, hot leaf litter fire, or maybe more of an intermediate sized fire, it controls them. It keeps them out of the woods, and it does a lot of work for you. If you have a highly infested woods, the odds of getting a fire to go through it are pretty low, especially if they're really, really, really big plants, and they might be getting to the point where their bark is finally getting thick enough to resist some fire. But young plants, after control has been established, they just have no capacity to cope with that. There's absolutely no way you can.
That just plays right into, like my farm. I've done the heavy lifting, and I'm going to be worried about that regeneration this spring from the stumps from last year that didn't get treated. Instead of having to go back in with all the chemical and more grinding and all the heavy lifting, is once you get that, and I had some that were as big as a tree. I mean, the trunk of it, 15 foot tall, close canopy from the honeysuckle. So, I've got most of that done. So now it's like, this information, I'm just excited to go, okay. I get year 3 out of my equip program done, and every couple of years now, it's a square woods, and we're in East Central. It's a block woods. Field around it. I got grass around it. So it's a perfect example of get the right conditions to do that slow forestry burn in it. And every few years, like you said, just every 3, 4, 5 years, you let it run through there, and it's have to do all of that work. It's like, oh, hey, let's just have a couple buddies come over, and there's some steaks on the grill, and go burn this 5-acre, 10-acre woods. And when everybody sit around, make sure everything's good, and have lunch, and have the kids and the family around, and enjoy the afternoon. But my goodness, if we knew about this 15, 20 years ago, and the value of it, how different could some of these programs look, and how we manage them.
And this is a absolutely blossoming field of study. It's been known in a lot. It's been known in a lot of areas that this is important, but it does, especially in the southern and the pine ecosystem, longleaf pine. This is critical for it. Most of the southern yellow pines, it is critical. Up here, people just didn't really consider, how much that was important. And wow, I mean, things that fit into this ecology of a high precipitation, high fire return interval, it's really niche. It is hard, from what I can see, for things from other continents to really fit into that ecology. Yeah.
All right, Michael, I got some questions, man. All right.
I think Kix on his heels. He's reeling, trying to keep up with all this.
So let's say somebody has, 20 acres, hasn't never been burnt, never been cleaned up. Let's just say got years and years and years worth of leaf litter on it, right? You're not going to be able to, I may be incorrect in saying this, but to me, you're going to have to burn that multiple times, because aren't all those under layers of leaves for over the years, aren't they going to be pretty wet and pretty hard to burn?
Yep, that's a fantastic point. So how you go about that, normally what we say in a woodland that has been devoid of fire for quite some time, the first fire is going to be hard to push. It's going to take some work to get it to happen. There was a paper that came out a few years ago that described the effects of this close canopy-ness, I guess you'd call it, on our eastern forests, and it was called the mesification of eastern forests. And what that means is simply by keeping more shade on the ground for a longer period of time with no direct sunlight and all this mulch, it does exactly what mulch does in the shade and keeps the ground extremely wet. And it progressively starts to keep the climate of that microsite more and more wet. So eventually, to break through that, you will have to do some canopy disturbance. So you'll want to remove the mid-story, trees that are not in the overstory, trees that are of undesirable, things that you aren't targeting. So basically, if it's not an oak or a hickory or some other species that you want there, that needs to be removed, especially in the mid-story, so that we can let that light in. And then just disturb the overstory. If you have trees that are not worth any money, or trees that have severe damage, hollow butts, things like that, that have no economic value, just girdle them, kill them. even if they're in the overstory. Those make good trees for all sorts of wildlife to use. So that now that you're introducing the light to help try to dry out that soil, that's typically your first step there. And then after that, you kind of maybe let it go for a growing season, do that in the spring, look at it in the fall. You want to get it dry. You want to make sure it's really dry. Obviously, mind any kind of local warnings about conditions, I guess you might say, and try to pick a really good dry time. It may have to be in the fall that first year, or it could be in the spring if you get lucky and have a nice dry spring. And in the south, that's easier to achieve. It's also easier to achieve growing season burns the further south you go. Sometimes those work quite well. But it's that first burn will be quite hard, and then the next few after that will get easier and easier as the site kind of reestablishes itself as more of a dry site, with the incredible amounts of light coming into it.
So basically, just the preparation is just a heavy TSI program.
Yes, you do lots of timber stand improvement, and potentially some light logging.
If a guy's never burnt before, he shouldn't expect to burn off all his leaf litter on the first burn at all.
You'll get a lot of it if you get it dry enough, but you won't get it all. It'll take a couple times to get it all burnt through a couple cycles. Those first few years, you might have to burn a couple years in a row if you really are struggling to get it to go before you can finally kind of relinquish yourself to that 3 to 5 year interval. It takes a little time to get it back into shape because, it's just like going out for a run. If you haven't done it in 10 years, it's going to be pretty hard. And the more and more you do it, the more and more you get used to it. So it's the same principle. These ecosystems is like that.
Would it be a smart idea for a guy to go in there with a skid steer or tractor or something and just kind of rake it all up at the first time and then start burning it after that? Or is that?
I think on a large scale, that's probably not super easy to do, and you might invoke quite a bit of damage. But it's something you could do if you have an area that, if it's really bad or you got a lot of brush or something like that, that might be applicable. But it's mainly timing. You got to find it when it's good and dry, and even when the soil beneath has little or less moisture in it. And that's a whole nother thing, is kind of getting into how do you conquer your fear of this. Woodland fires, especially in the east, seldom get aggressive. I'm sure there's situations where that's not true. If you're burning under a 25-foot tall cedar thicket, you'll have a crown fire. It'll happen, So there's situations where you have to be remarkably aware, and other pine species that might have strong ladder fuels you might have to watch out for. But in broadleaf eastern deciduous forest, it is going to be pretty hard to get something that's going to get out of control. Your biggest issue would be igniting something adjacent, whether that be a field, something that's really not intended, So it's getting comfortable with that. A lot of universities and other associations will have learn and burn events where you can go out and kind of get acquainted with it. You can, the federal government as well as some state governments put on programs for learning about a prescribed fire. If you can find professionals in your area that do it, I'm sure they wouldn't mind having a little more manpower behind it. But there's plenty of resources in the day and age of the internet. You can learn anything you want in any capacity, probably quite well. So if you're willing to go through the effort to educate yourself on it and go through all the safety measures, and there's no shame in having the volunteer fire department there. There's no shame in that at all. It's actually
some of them. This is new to them, so
Yes.
You can use it for a training expedition. So
Yes.
it can be that. And you said one thing, Michael, and this is something I've learned over the years because myself and some of Tom and Zach and some of the other agents here in Indiana, we do burns together at some of our friends' places, some of their farms, almost every year to 2 years. So we've burnt a lot of ground over the years. Mm-hmm. The main thing is, and Kix, you started to touch on it just a hair, is the preparation, and then have a plan. Which directions to wind, and how's it going to affect the burn, and what is my end result want to be. Mm-hmm. And if everybody's got kind of the same game plan, if you will, and on the same page, it's really enjoyable to do. Once in a while, if the wind changes just a little bit, somewhere there in the middle, it can get a little nerve wracking for a little bit. But, if you got a plan, you got your fire break set, you got the right people with you, got the tools, it can be very enjoyable to do, a learning experience for a lot of people that don't get to see it very often. If the landowners that we help do it on their properties that don't know how to, they're always amazed. Absolutely. At the end of it, it is something they talk about every time you see them.
Yes.
Hey, when are we going to burn again? We saw this. We found that the shed antler out in the middle of the field. So it's a wonderful tool. It just, again, it's one of those, how did we not know about this 10 or 15 years ago and the application of it? And, we were burning all these grass fields and the woods was right beside us and we were scared to death. that it was going to
Yep.
get in the woods.
Yep. I mean, your typical woodland fire in this part of the country, you're going to have flame lengths of less than a foot. It's just going to be really hard to get something achieved over that. We can go through some of the basics of things you may want to consider if this is something you might be interested in. Always look at wind speed. Wind speed is critical. If it's too slow, you won't get good lift on your smoke and get it out of there. Usually they say anywhere between 5 and 15 miles an hour is a pretty good gauge for that. The faster it gets, the more intense the fire is going to get, and the easier it will be for flare-ups to happen. So keep that in mind. While that wind might make it burn good and hot, it's also going to make it likely for other things to happen that may not be intended, and things happen far faster with higher wind speeds. But sometimes you have to have it. Watch your humidity. Relative humidity plays relative humidity could be, in my opinion, the most important part. Watch the day, see how that humidity is going to change throughout the day. The fire lit at 9 a.m. and a fire lit at 3 p.m. are on the exact same day will be remarkably different. If you worry about it, evening fires are fantastic. It makes hot spots easy to find. If you start it, in the kind of the later afternoon, so that way by the time you're, trying to mop up and look for everything, it'll be in the evening. Hot spots are easy to see. And also, the humidity is going to increase. So it's going to make it a lot harder for things to get wild. Whereas if you ignite something at noon and it's a long project, by the time you're nearing the end of that fire, things are going to be dry.
Yep.
You really have to watch relative humidity. Mm-hmm. Around here, if we want to lower relative humidity. If you're in Florida, 70% relative humidity is low. Things are going to get hot fast. Whereas up here, we're shooting for a little lower than that. Learn your fire terminology. Know the difference between a head fire, a backfire, a flanking fire, when they're applicable, things like that. This is all readily available, and there's plenty of literature online you can read about it that does fantastic jobs explaining it. Learn when the correct time to burn is for your habitat. Every habitat's different, and you're going to get a lot of different opinions about it, but you can read it and sift through the literature and figure out, well, maybe I ought to try burning in the fall instead of the spring, or maybe, it just is all dependent. And that's something else I'd like to mention. I have the name of this article here, and the one that I was referencing earlier, and it goes through and it shows how applicable it is for each timing event, and it talks about good fire regimes for basically all the different important game species and non-game species, and it's called Fire Effects on Wildlife in the Central Hardwoods and Appalachian Regions. And it's an article, or it's a piece of literature by Craig Harper et al. It was published in 2016. It is peer reviewed, so at times it can be a bit heady to read, but it's very worth it. It's very worth it to look up that article and go through it, because it will give you fantastic information for all these game species and burn intervals. It touches on the issues about timing if you have, box turtle populations and stuff like that you don't want to impact, how to not hurt salamanders, all this stuff. Or, how to burn your openings in your woodland to maybe even, entice quail to use them more often. That's going to be a lot of burning. You're going to be burning every 2 years if you want to get quail to kind of enticed into your woods per se. Whereas if you want grouse, you're going to be burning more like 8 years. Up here, there's no grouse, so it doesn't really matter. But
and you mentioned Craig Harper. He's got some other great literature out there for habitat management and stuff that so yeah, he's a resource that I've followed for quite a few years. You did a burn last year on one of your farms, didn't you? Well, you're a CRP.
No, it was a woodland burn. It was 2 years ago though. Yeah, and we've done it for a while down here actually. I'll tell you a funny story, though. The only reason we ever even started doing it, it's probably, I don't even know how many years ago, we had some trespassers here, kids, teenage or younger kids trespassing on our property over there. And they found an old abandoned plastic cooler and thought that it would be a good idea to start lighting stuff on fire and try to melt that cooler down. Well, ended up catching the whole entire forest on fire, and all 20 acres or whatever, and we had to call the fire department, come put it out. It ended up being a whole situation. But after that, we started realizing that, man, this really changed the landscape around here. Like, this is amazing. And so just to try to keep that leaf litter off and, try to keep some kind of habitat. And we also noticed that our turkeys came back. When we first moved on that place, we had all kinds of turkeys. And then all of a sudden, one year, like, there were no turkeys anywhere around. And so, but after them kids burnt our property on accident, they started coming back. And so that really changed our opinion on, hey, we got to keep this clean. We got to keep this leaf litter off of here and keep this going. So we've tried to do it every few years since then, at least, and try to keep up on it.
That's fantastic. That's absolutely fantastic to hear. Sometimes those accidents are the happiest ones. There's some really unintended consequences. Something else I'd like to touch on is a lot of people have many different opinions about eastern red cedar. And I know this is a smoking hot topic. There's people that love red cedar for thermals, and there's people that really have no affinity for it at all. I'm one of the people that lean more towards having zero affinity for eastern red cedar in any capacity. There's a reason that it burns so well and it's extremely flammable. It's because it's incongruent with fire. If you're in an area that's evolved with fire and you have really dense red cedar thickets, they may not be they probably shouldn't be there. Those areas are really good areas to find a lot of really nice early succession habitat and diversity. And what I mean is killing a lot of cedar. If you have big expanses of cedar thickets, 5-6 acres, even less, just large areas, it's typically because it was either farmed or the soil is poor. It could have historically been a barren if you're further south. So these areas were disturbed, 30, 40, 50 years ago and then allowed to grow up. These are prime examples of places where you can just cut down the cedar, pile it, and get it all piled up as brush and burn these piles, and then you have really ready-made early succession habitat that will probably abut right up to a very nice woodland. Typically, the areas that are allowed to regrow were allowed to go, fallow for a reason. It's because the site's bad. It's next to another adjoining woodland, something like that. So that's something else you can add to your large-scale management schemes. A lot of people worry about thermals for deer. White-tailed deer live in the UP of Michigan. That's all I'll say about that. You can kind of infer what you'd like. So down the further south you go, I don't really see how important that may be. So I typically err on the side of getting rid of species like that, some of those more ruderal natives per se. So that, like I said, that can be some ready-made early succession habitat that's going to have probably a quite nice seed bank under it ready to be expressed. So, and that's another thing is, well, like we kind of talked about earlier, well, you're burning your early succession habitat already, so why aren't you burning your woods? And everybody's afraid of getting into the woods. That's a good example of where you can burn them together. You do want to divide up your habitat so you're not burning it all at once, especially early succession. But there's no reason why these can't, a fire started in early succession habitat can't just be allowed to go ahead and creep right into a woodland. It's the way it was intended. It's how those fires got started. They came from the prairies, they came roaring across, at least in Indiana, the northern part of the state, and they got south of Indianapolis, and they hit really large oak woodlands. And these oak woodlands were very happy to receive that fire. It would just keep going right through them and just burn until it hit something that it could no longer burn through. And while it's doing this, it's going to be spreading. We're talking about natural fire here. Back in the day, would have been spreading, along high wind events that would have been throwing a bunch of sparks, a bunch of embers through chimney trees, and it really would have been taking off. Another implication for wildlife here that I may want to bring up is a lot of times there's people that worry about old growth forests and some of the specialty wildlife that depends on them. One is owls. Owls, it seems, really enjoy old growth woodlands, closed canopy with an empty understory. I've often wondered about this and how feasible that has been the more I've learned about this disturbance ecology of this area. And something else that also has very little vertical growth in the understory, surrounded by very large trees, are extremely well-burnt oak woodlands. I'm assuming that the owls may have also had quite the affinity for that. I'm not sure how dependent that was on true old growth. I'm sure people that are more preservationists would highly disagree with that, but I feel like it's quite hard to prove. And then there's many other implications of that. So when it comes to these large trees. But one thing that I could say now to kind of tie this whole thing of burning and all this back to forestry. Why is this important? This has been one big ecology tangent or one big wildlife management tangent. Why do I as a forester really care that much? I just really deal in trees. I don't really deal much in the rest of it or botany or anything like that. Well, we're having, particularly in Indiana and in this area, we have in between Kentucky as well, we have a initiative called the White Oak Initiative. And there's an extreme concern for the lack of regeneration of oak. Oak is not coming back. It's not replacing itself at all. Now you kind of see from the reasons we've discussed why that may be. It's getting replaced by beech and maple. The trees are being logged, high-graded out of woods. They're getting old and dying, a multitude of things, and they're being replaced by that shade-tolerant mid-story underneath. So now we can see where the fire ecology is remarkably important. We've kicked one leg out of this, chair, so to speak, and the ecology is broken. It's shade tolerant now. It's full of really thick, wet leaf litter with no undergrowth of herbaceous plants to support this leaf litter and keep it aerated. And it's just perpetually replacing itself with beech and maple. This is not the habitat that used to exist here. If somebody from 700-800 years ago looked at this, it would be unrecognizable. And that's where the necessity for understanding the ecology of the landscape has come from. If you want to perpetuate oak, if you like drinking whiskey and you like oak barrels, there's an importance here. Oak is disappearing at an extremely high rate because of how extremely valuable, especially white oak is. It's remarkably valuable. It gets cut down to, 10, 12-inch logs. That's not a sustainable use of the resource. We often say in forestry circles, if you cut oak or log oak before you have adequate regeneration, that's one of the biggest no-nos per se in the forestry world. Is if it's not there and you're cutting it, it won't be back. So you have to prepare the habitat, you have to start the burning cycle, and you have to get the regeneration. As a forester, I don't really care about individual trees per se. I care about the species, the population health. So I'm not particularly a tree hugger, So once these trees have reached a old desirable age and they have a high merchantable value, and you've done the work to regenerate it, cut those trees, make the money. The next cohort's there in the understory. You've been burning for 10 years. You have an extremely strong cohort. Every time you stop burning, it wants to come back very aggressively. Harvest that overstory. If you have a woods full of really nice oak regeneration, you can clear cut it. And by clear cutting, all you're doing is just mimicking a large fire that would have been a stand replacing incident and killed all these overstory trees, or a large wind event, anything like that. It's part of the ecology. Now, do you probably want to do that because now you're going to be out of acorns for 20 years? Probably not, but you could, and the habitat would like it. The animals would like it. They don't mind that. That's what they evolved with, was these aggressive disturbance events. So that's, to tie it all back together, to this kind of wildlife management can be extremely profitable. If you can do a lot of this work yourself, or get government programs like we talked about last time to help pay to get this work done and get the fire going and get comfortable doing it yourself, work with a professional the first time. That's fine. Have them show you how to do it. Most people are very busy that do this. And if you say, I can tackle that, fantastic. They're more than happy to give you as many pointers as you want. So get this, get the ball rolling, get it going the right direction, get your regeneration there, get the habitat fixed, make the animals remarkably happy. And then make money. That's the whole point of forestry, is to utilize the resource. And as long as you're practicing sound management strategies and you're not basically just cutting your woods over and leaving all the residual stuff that nobody wants and will never be worth any money, this is how you do it. This is how it goes hand in hand. Preservation and like ecological sustainability they're not the same, because preservation, the act of doing nothing basically to a wildland area, we've seen what it's done in this area. It's overrun with shade tolerance and invasives, and it's a woodland that is completely broken and cannot replace itself and never will be able to. It's doomed basically just to spiral to the end of time until it's in a thicket of invasives and there's no trees. It just can't. It can't maintain itself. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of how it all comes together.
So, Michael, you touched on something that clear cutting. I know you can use that as a tool, obviously, for wildlife management and woodland management. How are we seeing much where they're doing? I've seen it down in Southeast Ohio quite a bit, where I hunted down around Chillicothe and all that area, is they do those large scale clear cuts of a whole side. Are they looking at implementing the burning after the clear cut once you've got that 3, 4, 5 year regrowth where, it's 4 or 5 foot tall, with all the diversity of all the different trees, is then doing a burn then to try to set back all that, the poplars and the beech and all the stuff that's grown up and let the oaks get a restart. Have you seen them using that together yet, or is that kind of like the next step?
That can be done. You can burn after clear cuts. They typically burn quite well. There's a bunch of slash to work through. In those situations, unless the woodland has been burnt before, that one post-burn, unless you had some anchored regeneration, is going to struggle to really produce anything of much importance in terms of oak. If you're on more southern sites with harder site indexes and things like that, indices, it could happen. You may have some oak hanging out in the understory anyways on these poor sites, and it can work. But if you happen to acquire a property that's recently been clear cut, you can still burn it. It's good. It's never going to hurt that site at all to burn. Now there's reasonable limitations to everything, but still clear cutting can be implemented in patch clear cuts. We're not talking stand leveling. If you own 120 acres and you just whack that puppy, you don't have to do that. You can implement a 6 or 7 acre clear cut once you have this regeneration. and you can do patches. In silviculture, we call that shelter wood. It's where you go and remove a lot of the overstory until it's about 50 or 60 square feet of basal area. Then you start doing these aggressive burning regimen, and you get the regeneration you desire. And after that regeneration has been produced, that's the next step in a shelter wood, is to clear cut. And it works great. You get fantastic oak regeneration. It's ready. You take the overstory off that thing, and then here comes that next cohort of oak. Now, granted, it's going to be 100 years before it's ready to be harvested.
We're dealing with trees. None of them are tomorrow kind of
Yep.
situation. So
Yep. Absolutely. So you can pick and choose. You can do smaller patch cuts. You can do acre patches. You can do stuff like that. You can do kind of a mosaic, a grid pattern across the landscape. So, you have a woodland that's, 100 acres, and you have, 5 different age cohorts through there. So every 10 years, you're doing a clear cut somewhere in that woods. And now, so that whole woods is now mosaic. You can even put it in squares. I mean, you can make it super easy. You can follow contours of the land if you have a super hilly property, things like that. And you can just start to develop this plan in your head of, say, well, I got 100 acres, and you're going to start working through it. And that mosaic habitats are some of the most important for wildlife. So that way you can have early succession where there is nothing woody in there because it just got smoked with the fire, and then you have old growth next to it. Here, per se, old growth. Let's call that, for the terms of this argument, 150-year-old timber, whatever. There's truly very little old growth left in the world. So,
that's Southern Ohio. I've obviously, I grew up in Ohio, went to college down in Nelsonville, Ohio, at Hocking College and stuff. And I've spent a lot of time, not only during my college years, but afterwards, hunting down there. And what we learned was, you look at a clear cut and it is not easy to look at, right?
yes.
But once you get about 10 or 15 years into it, we had one farm in particular. It was an 80 or 90 acre clear cut on a ridge top that fed off into big draws and stuff. And what we learned quickly was that transition area from the clear cut to the hardwoods was a magical area to be in.
Yes.
Once it got to be about 10, say 15 years old, to where you didn't want to have to walk through it. You couldn't most of the time, but the amount of forage that was out there that the deer were eating during the, that late October, early November timeframe was absolutely amazing. The amount of deer that were piled into there. And, the bucks would be out there chasing does all day through that clear cut. You couldn't see them. You just hear them and, watch the trees bouncing around and stuff. The different perspective I now have about a clear cut when I see it, that first year or two, it's hard on my heart. I'm a tree guy. I love them. I love working with, playing them. I've got, a bunch I'm going to do this year, but that magnificent piece of when that where it transitions from the clear cut to that timber, all the way around it. We had some wonderful hunts, harvested some great deer, but just seeing to see as that change, from the 3, 4, 5 year, the clear growth, the 5, 6 year, 10 year, 15 year, we hunted that farm for 30 or 40 years, I guess, total. And to get to watch the transition and how it changed, and as they got older, you started getting, to where you could walk under the understory with eating up. But to be able to do just exactly like you're saying, using that as a piece of your habitat management, inlet areas, and being able to go, okay, well, where's your predominant winds at? What do you want to do? What's your goal here? And then start putting those pieces together along with your food plots and your warm season grass plans, your CRP programs. That's I don't see very much of it in this area of people utilizing that one piece of that management programs. And, all of us are going to, someday, no matter what we're going to do, we're going to pass it on to somebody else.
Yep.
And that's just one more long, it's the long game of, what's it going to look like in 50 years, 100 years from now?
Absolutely. And one thing I might add, a very well-managed landscape that perfectly represents the pre-contact state of what your ground used to represent. If everything is there is very little supplementation that needs to be done. The efficacy and the usefulness of food plots at times, there's always a case for that. But and then in the large grand scheme of things, there are very few crutches that are left, by the time that habitat is truly representative of what used to be there. And once it is, and it's doing it to the greatest extent and is fully functioning the way it was intended to, what else is there? That's all the animals evolved with. That's what for millions of years, they've been dealing with this exact situation. So once you can supply it to them, what else do they need? It's really...
You're telling me I don't need to be planting clover food plots. Is that what I'm hearing here?
If you got the right habitat, you may not need clover food plots. other than for a fire break. But which is a
There you
really
go.
good example.
That's
when
what almost all of us use is, a good clover
Yep.
road all the way around it. Easy to maintain, mowed it a few times a year. And then, if you need
Mhm.
to, you can, do your chemical application, get rid of the grasses and the weeds and stuff.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to fire control, there's multiple schemes for how to do it. If you're in the woodland, one of the best things you can possibly use is a leaf blower. Leaf blowers work great. They work great in your yard. They work great in the driveway. They work great in the woods. Wherever there's leaves, you can blow them out of the way. And these are fantastic.
Even for the CRP stuff, just in case it gets there. We've got a whole side by side or two full of them, the backpack ones, the hand ones, and just, normally about all you need, as long as you don't get the big wind gusts like you were talking about, where those can cause a little, heart running and everybody on one side get the blowers going. But it's amazing. Like I said, when you first started talking to me about the woodland fire, what it will do. And then when you finally got to the point of, the invasive piece of it, the light bulb just went on and it just blew up on me. It's like, oh my God, what have we been missing?
Yeah.
And how do we as habitat land managers and stewards, how can we implement this into what we already do? But again, it's, we've all been scared over the years of, we're burning the CRP. Don't want to get it in the woods with all the leaf matter. Not thinking about, like you said, how much moisture is laying there under that, that top layer is nice and brown and crusty, but you get under and it's just nothing but moisture.
Yep. And when you think about it, once that leaf litter's burn off, it has a whole summer to dry. That whole next year is just going to be cooking in the sun, and all the wind's going to be very accessible to it, and it's going to really start to dry out that microsite. And the beauty of it is it makes it even harder for invasion, because a lot of these invasive species really don't care for really dry sites. A lot of the trees we don't like also don't like really dry sites. It's a multifaceted benefit. The more the habitat gets broken, the easier it gets for it to continue to fall into disrepair. It's just like personal health. It's all the exact same. It's just, you could look at the environment as just one big organism. The more legs you kick out from under it, the sooner it's going to fail. And the more you put back, the more robust it will be, the more it will be very immune to these invasions and to other issues. Yeah, and when it comes to woodland burning, if you have, tree kill, that's fine. If you get large trees that die, I have seen 16 to 18-inch tulip poplar get killed by a fire that was creeping up a hill. That was a ground fire. It killed them, burnt the bark off the whole base of those things. Well, it got them hot enough and the bark was falling off when I saw them. If you've ever seen when a horse eats the bark off a tree, it looked very similar to that. And those trees were dead. They were completely stone cold dead. They did not live through that whatsoever. And there was another site down in southern Indiana where I witnessed a very large burn had taken place, and the stand was mostly chestnut oak. And chestnut oak is probably the most fire resistant, maybe next to post oak of the white oaks. It can take remarkably hot fires. The fire got so hot there, it broke their sensors that were being used to monitor that. And it killed everything that was not a chestnut oak. All the maple of varying sizes, it killed it all. And that site had not been frequently burned. It had a lot of leaf litter. It was on a hill. It was a very dry site in southern Indiana. And they can get hot. They can get really hot depending on the time of year, and they can kill a lot of stuff. Typically, your moderate ground fire, if it's bigger than an inch at the base, it's probably not going to kill it. But there's a spectrum. If you get it really, really, really hot, it'll burn, and it'll kill a lot of stuff.
Like you said, it can change as the burn's going on.
Yes.
The environment is constantly changing. So
yes, it's remarkably variable. There's something else. If anybody's really interested in kind of what their habitat might have looked like pre-contact, go out there and look. See what species are there. See what relic species are there. See what the really, really, really old species are around you. These old trees that are remnants from pastures, stuff like that. Is it post oak? Is it white oak? Is it bur oak? Things like this. Look for really large red oaks even. Look for these species that are indicators of why is it here? Why did it used to be here? Well, maybe there's a reason. And then also, one thing that I like to do, which is going to sound really odd when I describe it, but in the fall time, and you want to learn what your local flora is in terms of herbaceous plants, go out, drive the country roads and look in the ditches around August, June, July, August, September, October. There's going to be a bunch of species flowering out there. And if you don't know what they are, stop, get out and figure it out. Are these species, if there's a bunch of these early or, kind of perennial herbaceous plants, figure out what they are. And they probably have a really strong fire ecology tie. And if you, start managing your property, these are species you might want to reintroduce to it if they are no longer there. And even a lot of these will thrive in part shade and woodlands. There's a vast array of species, multiple milkweeds, all sorts of members of the aster family. There's a fantastic array of species that are 100% dependent upon that fire regime. And if it's been gone for long enough in your woods, the plants will be gone. But that's a whole nother level of ecological restoration. You can bring them back. You know, if you see these are local species, you can bring them back, and the wildlife will like them. You know, the ecology will like them. The birds will like them. It'll just help even increase more diversity within your property. Go to natural areas that are around there that might be owned by land conservancies that might be burning, anything like that, and just start to check them out. You know, figure out what used to be here and what do they do and what do they like.
Maybe we can bring it back with a little fire.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely.
I tell you what, I just keep scratching my head, Michael. Every time we talk about it, I learn something else about it that I either didn't think about, or, you know, what the cause and effect of it can be.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Michael is a wealth of information and knowledge. He's available to all of us. I mean, he's got, you know, every time I shoot him a text or something within an hour or two, he usually responds.
Yep.
I mean,
yep.
He's not just a resource for me here in Indiana. I mean, we've talked to him twice now that, you know, the guy will talk to anybody about when it comes to trees and habitat and, you know, the good, the bad, you know, what to do, what to look for, what chemicals are working better that maybe they didn't used to, you know, all these things. He's a wealth of knowledge. He's, you know, one of the brightest young guys I've ever met about, and enthusiastic about the woodland habitat and, you know, our environment and all, you know, everything involved with it. So I'm thankful that I've got him here, you know, basically next door, and just couldn't enjoy talking to him more. He's just a wealth of knowledge, and I enjoy it. I tell you what, I'm just now thinking, what do I got to do this spring?
One last thing is, the most important part about this for you on a personal level as an individual is the reward you get from it. There's truly something about, you go out in the woods in the wintertime and you make these openings, you disturb it, you get sunlight to the ground. Pay attention to the birds that are in there beforehand, and then pay attention to the birds that are after. There's going to be a lot more species that utilize that. If you do a prairie planting or anything like that and really get this burning underway and a lot of flowering species, that's one thing you'll notice. You can stand out in your yard, you can stand in a field, and you don't hear a lot of bugs. You get into one of these situations and the invertebrate diversity is wild. They're flying everywhere. It's more like a cloud around these habitats. And then it really puts into perspective why we're seeing so much species decline within these birds that are predatory on insects. You know, when you start to see it all come back together, the birds realize that the resources there, and the insects realize the resources there, and it starts to build itself back up. It gets remarkably diverse, and it's remarkably satisfying. That's the most important part of this whole thing, is kind of getting addicted to how nice that feeling is of seeing, wow, I've truly made a big difference for things that otherwise did not have a chance. So
absolutely. Absolutely.
Bring the turkey back for Kix.
All right, guys. Well, Michael, again, thank you. If you guys didn't listen to episode 1, or part 1, I should say, go and check it out on our Facebook, YouTube page. It's on there. This is part 2 with Michael Bain, consulting forester, and Dean Brandt. Guys, I appreciate you coming back on here, getting episode part 2 done here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us, Kix, and taking the time for us.
Yes, thank you very much.
All right, guys. Don't forget to follow Dean Brandt on social media, Dean Brandt, Indiana, Basecamp Country Real Estate. Don't forget to follow Michael Bain. Follow Basecamp Country Real Estate everywhere you can find us at Basecamp Country. Don't forget, here at Basecamp Country, it's more than just dirt. It's a lifestyle. We will see you guys again next week right here on the Basecamp Country podcast. Thanks, guys.